If you want to get big, you have to focus on stretch-mediated hypertrophy. If you want to get big, you have to train to failure. If you want to get bigger, you have to do full range of motion exercises. These are all things that you've heard before. Hey folks, welcome back. In today's lecture, I'm going to be refuting 3 common hypertrophy exercise strategies that you hear on YouTube Fitness. They're very common, and I'm going to be debunking them, not because I completely disagree with them in the sense that if you emphasize these things that it won't help your gains, or that they don't have any potential benefit, or that I never use them. In fact, to some degree, I actually incorporate each and every one of these in my training, although not necessarily for the purpose that you hear people prescribe to them. I'm going to get into it. I might make a series of these videos refuting hypertrophy strategies because there's a lot of them out there, and I disagree with a lot of them, probably even most of them. So this might be a playlist of its own, but either way, it'll be on the Smart and Simple Lecture Series playlist. So go ahead and check the rest of that out. Links in the description. But either way, let's get right into it. So guys, it's not that I hate these strategies. It's not that they're terrible, but they are by no means non-essential to your training. What I want to convince you by the end of the day is that you do not have to do these things in order to grow. Even if you're not focused on strength and you just call yourself a bodybuilder, in no way, shape, or form do you have to do these things. They are not needs. They are not essential to your training. They might be a benefit. They're the nuanced element of training, but these are not the meat and potatoes, the bread and butter of training. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Number 1, you hear stretch-mediated hypertrophy touted as being this excellent way of stimulating growth compared to not doing exercises that put you in a significantly stretched position. What would be 2 examples? Well, you could contrast the strict curl done with either dumbbells or a barbell compared to an incline curl that puts you in more of a stretched position at the start of the rep. The truth is this, and it should be obvious. If you train biceps curls, you are going to grow bigger biceps over time if you accumulate tonnages. Is there potentially a disproportionate benefit in the stretch position? Well, maybe only insofar as this. If you control for the amount of weight used and the number of reps performed with that weight in a given session, the person who does a larger range of motion, focusing on a stretch position in the bottom, probably is doing more work, but you have to be strong enough in order to be able to handle that increase in work to begin with. So if the total work in a workout is higher in terms of raw physics, right, foot-pounds or joules, then yes, then that works. Same thing with tonnages, right? If an exercise allows you to lift more weight, you're accumulating higher tonnages. But it's also true that sometimes you get more out of less weight, right? So it's not obvious to me that this stretch position has some magic benefit. And you might say, well, what about the tendon and the stretch reflex? Sure, but if the stretch reflex of an exercise is allowing you to lift heavier weight, is that really your muscle, or is that your tendon that you're targeting? And it's okay to do some work that directly targets your tendons, but the benefit of that you would think would be mostly for your tendons. So if you've ever struggled with tendinopathies before in your hamstrings, biceps, triceps, tendons, things like that, probably doing some blood flow focused work with a large range of motion, with an emphasis on a stretch position in the start position or end position, that probably does have a tendon strengthening benefit. But does it have a hypertrophy benefit? Well, some people say that studies make it obvious and experience makes it obvious. It's not obvious to me, guys. I've been training dumbbell strict curls, just going straight up and down till my elbows are mostly extended, till my arms are up all the way, and I'm getting great results. Why? Because I'm accumulating volume, I'm focusing on tonnage, and I'm applying the 2 fundamental principles that I talk about a lot on this channel, the principle of specificity and progressive overload. You want bigger biceps, you have to do something that's a resisted elbow flexion. And what's progressive overload? Well, you need to gradually, manageably, work harder over time to a degree that you can still recover from consistently, right? Okay, so yes, it's true you can use these exercises, but progressive overload does not rely on a stretch mediation. It is also true that when you shorten the muscle under a load, that's work, right? If you have to contract your muscle to move an object from point A to point B, that's work. Having a larger distance between those 2 points means more work with the same given load. It's not obvious where this magical physiological benefit from the stretch comes from. More work is more work. Accumulating more work over time is progressive overload. Guys, it really is that simple. And you can ask me to try and prove this point, but with logic, I hope I can demonstrate why it's obvious that you simply need to train your biceps, work harder over time. You can pick an exercise that feels good. I encourage you to do that. You can have a variety of biceps exercises, 2 or 3 if you really want. But whatever work you do, it better be not past the upper limit of what you can recover from, and it better not be so low that you don't get a stimulus, right? Movements that feel good are dramatically more important than a stretch position. If you train incline curls and it feels terrible on your shoulder, end of your tendons for your bicep, or the distal end down by your elbow, then maybe you should consider using a different movement, maybe even incline curls or preacher curls or cable curls, right? There's so many different ways to train your biceps. There's not one particular way to do it, okay? Do a movement that feels good, because if it feels good, you're going to stick to it. If it feels good, chances are, as long as you don't overtrain it consistently, right? You make it manageable, you're probably not going to get injured from it. That's the way to go, okay? And look, there's a lot of things people talk about: peak contractions and stretches and instabilities and pauses and fast reps and tempo reps. And guys, you can't have it all in one exercise, and you can't have it all in one program. So even if each of these nuanced perspectives and strategies for getting extra hypertrophy out of a movement, for a particular movement pattern or for a particular muscle on your body, isolated, guess what? You can't have it all at once. So even if there is a potential benefit to stretch-mediated hypertrophy, if it's a real thing, guess what? You're going to be focusing less on a nice, smooth strength curve or a peak contraction. There's things that you have to lose in order to gain, right? It comes down to trade-offs. I'm not saying these exercises are bad, right? You can load an incline curl appropriately or pelican curl. But if you don't like that movement, you don't have to train it. And it's not obvious that it's a detriment not to, okay? Work equals force times displacement. That is the basic physics of exercise. Without being too much of a nerd about it, you know, smart, simple, fit, okay? So here's the simple part. This equation of work equaling force times displacement, this is the inescapable truth that is equivalent to calories in, calories out, right? When people talk about weight loss, sure, there's plenty of nuance, metabolism and genetics, and what's your macro distribution, and are you fasting, what's your window of eating for the day, and what's your age, what's your gender, etc. Do you have diseases, etc., etc., etc. Okay, we got it. There's some nuance, but it all comes down to energy balance. That's the truth for weight loss, and guess what? With exercise, it all comes down to work, which is force times displacement. That's work. Accumulating work means you're applying a progressive stimulus, and as long as it's within the limit of what you can adapt to, you will. Feed your body resources, sleep, recover, go back in there, train again, you're going to get stronger. Stretch mediation, you're doing work. Whether it's from here to here, you're doing work, or from here to here, you're doing work, or all the way back here to here, you're doing work for your bicep. And because it's more work to do a larger range of motion with an emphasis on the stretch, you're going to have to use less weight. So it kind of balances out because you're not going to be as strong on a stretch movement, right? That makes sense. Obsessively stretching may be somewhat risky and under certain circumstances, right? Because you're going out of your way to put a little bit extra stress on your tendons, it may not be a good idea to force yourself into those positions if you're not used to that movement, like a deficit Romanian deadlift or deficit stiff leg deadlift or even pelican curls. Okay, if you're not used to that movement, you need to ease into it. Don't get snapped up. Don't beat up your tendons, right? You don't want to go out of your way to get tendonitis. So obsessing over the stretch maybe isn't the best habit. Be content with less than full range of motion. If that range of motion on this particular session at this particular moment in time feels good, then use that. And maybe you can progress from there. All right, that's it for the first one. Going on to the second one, training to failure. That is not necessary. Yes, it's fun to take a set of biceps curls or lateral raises or sometimes even compound movements, it feels really good to take it to the point where you feel like you're going to collapse, you can't do another rep. It's gratifying. You feel macho and manly doing that, right? You feel tough, training to the point where you can't do another rep. But guess what? It all comes back to the calories in, calories out equivalent, which is work equals force times displacement. You move some objects, eventually bigger objects, or you move them through a larger distance in space. Guess what? You're going to get bigger. You don't have to go to failure to do that. What is a set? What is failure? What are these things? Failure can have multiple definitions. To some people, failure means you physically fail on a rep. To some people, failure means that on the last rep or two, you start to cheat a little bit, and then it's really obvious that even with minimal cheating, you can't get another rep. And some people would say that it has to be super duper robotic and strict, like Mike Israetel style reps, where if you can't do another robot rep and you can only do a slight cheat rep, well, then that one doesn't count. So it's very subjective to what failure even means. In my opinion, failure means you simply could not do a rep, period, on following that last rep. So 0 reps in reserve, right? You can't do another rep. That means it's failure. You can argue with me about the nuance, but that's a simple enough definition, right? We can work with that. Okay, fine. But what is a set? A set is just an organized way to do work. Why do sets come to an end? Because the human body needs rest at some point, right? We're a living thing. We're flesh. We have cells. They need oxygen. They need fuel, right? They need carbohydrates to be broken down to supply those muscles. The glycogen breaking down. We can't infinitely train 1 set per session, right? You can't condense 3 sets into 1 set because you fatigue. So the fact that we have multiple sets is a reflection of the constraint of our physical nature. It is not because there is some inherent magical biological trigger that when you hit failure, oh, there's the extra growth that's coming out. Because if someone does 3 sets to failure and another person does 4 sets with 2 in reserve on each, you tell me what's harder. You would have to look at the specifics, calculate the tonnage to see which of those is harder. But I'll tell you what, often it's the case if you do 4 or 5 sets, they're just a little bit submaximal, 1 or 2 or 3 reps in reserve, you're going to find it's much more manageable. And if you're concerned about not getting enough work done, because if you don't go to failure, you're not getting enough work done, guess what? You can easily make up for a slight lack of intensity with just a little bit of an increase in volume. You don't have to do 100 sets a week to not train to failure and get big. But the point is, it's really easy to add that work somewhere else in a way that's more manageable. And guess what? It's not just compound movements, but also isolations that break down in technique when you go to failure. Biceps curls can go from being pretty strict to being pretty sloppy. We've all probably done and seen sloppy biceps curls. It's a bad habit. Same with lateral raises. Are you doing this or are you doing something like this? In which case, why? Why are you focusing on that? You're going too heavy. You're emphasizing failure too much. You need to focus on quality reps. That should be obvious. It's not just those compounds, but yes, even your isolations can break down in technique. Not training them to failure could be a good idea to ensure that your technique is better. Not perfect, but good, really good. And same thing when you talk about things like high intensity training, right? We just discussed why you can't condense all your work into 1 set. Well, guess what? Mike Mentzer disagrees. He has what's called high intensity training, where you just go 1 really all-out set to failure with a big nasty weight, and sometimes even go beyond failure. But guess what? That is silliness, because it's the tonnages, it's the work with the physics equation. That's what it comes down to. There's no reason why you can't take 20 pull-ups in a total session, right? Bodyweight pull-ups, and do them 2 at a time in 10 sets and call that 20 pull-ups. That's a hard workout if objectively that is between your minimum effective volume and your maximal recoverable volume. You will make gains despite the fact that those 2 rep sets might be pretty far away from failure. You might say, well, why would I want to do that? I don't know, you tell me. But I'm simply suggesting that you can, and you will get stronger, and more importantly for this context, you will get bigger, regardless of your proximity to failure. Okay, this might have a tiny benefit, and this might have a tiny benefit, but it is not worth losing sleep over. It's not worth reorienting your whole program over. Train in a way that feels good and gets you consistently working your butt off. That's what counts. Okay, so stimulative work does not necessarily mean exhaustive work, even though it's clear, right? Going back to high intensity training, sure, it works. Exhaustive training is definitely stimulative, but it's not always manageable. Think about back squats, think about deadlifts, think about even strict biceps curls with a easy curl bar, okay? Just because it's more stimulative per set doesn't mean that it's a good practice. And navigating, just like we're talking about MRV and MEV, right? You need to navigate those two things, the minimum amount of work you need to do to adapt and the maximum that you can recover from. Navigating that is the way forward for your hypertrophy for the rest of your life. That will never cease to be the case. You navigate between those 2 points. An amount of work that's between those two things is the amount of work that's going to get you to grow 100% of the time. And yes, there's food, calories, protein, right? Micronutrients, sleep, all those things come into the equation, but you need to navigate between those 2 points in order to grow. What else? Yeah, that's pretty good. And yeah, you can't really escape the reality of reps times set times weight. So if you do a calculation with your reps times your set times your weight, you'd be surprised how not going to failure often is going to set you up to accumulate more tonnages because you're going to feel better during this session. Okay, third, and certainly not least, full range of motion training. Do I believe in it? Should you do it? I don't know, let's get right into it. I think there are definitely cases where getting more range of motion is a better idea than getting less. For example, when we look at the anatomy of the quadriceps, again, without being a nerd, you have 4 quads, right? Hence quad. One of those quads, your vastus medialis, has a portion of it, the oblique fibers, that work to extend fully your leg, that works into terminal knee extension. It also works really hard when you're coming out of deep flexion, like on a full range of motion, quote unquote, leg press, or front squat ATG, or back squat ATG. And so in order to proportionally develop the quads, we can make an argument that full range of motion exercise, ATG, have a huge benefit for building up the stabilizer portion of the knee on the inside of the thigh, right? That is probably the case, but this is not the case for all exercises. And so while I would stress terminal extension with control of a joint under a manageable load, whether that's fully extending on an overhead press or bench press, or fully extending a squat, or maybe even going out of your way to go into deep knee flexion on a squat or leg press, that doesn't mean you have to maximize range of motion on everything all the time, especially if you're a beginner, because sometimes an extreme range of motion doesn't feel good, right? It takes time to build your squat. Often, you need to develop this range of motion, so work within your own limits, guys. If you can't squat ATG with a mostly or completely neutral spine, maybe don't. Start developing the habit where you crouch for 5 minutes every day, or 2 minutes before your first working set, okay? Get under that barbell, sit there in that pocket for a minute and just hang out. Your adductors, your quads are gonna loosen up, your ankles are gonna loosen up regardless of leverages. This is almost guaranteed to improve your squat pattern immediately, like within several sessions, within a couple weeks, guys. You will be a better squatter, but becoming an excellent squatter takes months. Okay? It's not overnight, right? And so in addition to that, just like with failure with the definition, there's really no such thing as full range of motion, right? I think natural hypertrophy's made this point before. You can always go just a little bit deeper. Look at the snatch position in Olympic lifting. That's deeper than people squatting ATG. Does that mean it's better? I don't know, you tell me. I'm not convinced that it is. It changes the mechanics of the movement. For the purpose of a snatch, it makes sense when you look at how deep people get into a position with regards to knee flexion, hip flexion, dorsiflexion, etc. But that doesn't mean you have to train every single leg exercise to mimic a snatch catch position, right? And so that's something to consider. And again, while I do say that leverages are not the biggest reason for choosing whether or not to train ATG squats, you need to just build up to them regardless. Leverages are still an important component. Some people are naturally very gifted at getting down into a squat position. I have long femurs, but I compensate for it by having flexible ankles. And so on an individual level, that helps me achieve, quote unquote, full range of motion, or at least what most people call a deep squat, right? Hips below parallel. That helps me as an individual. That might be different for you. And if you can build strength, and especially in this context, if you can build size with partials, we know this, floor presses, right? Going at 90-degree biceps curls, 90-degree leg presses, all kinds of things. Quarter squats build muscle, guys. I know that sounds terrible, doesn't it? Box squats build muscles. We know these partials build muscle and they make you stronger. So why would you ever need to maximize range of motion? I gave you one example of why it might be better to get more range of motion on the squat movement pattern for the sake of your quads being proportionally developed. But you know what? It is probably, in the grand scheme of things, non-essential to your overall hypertrophy goals. So train with partials. If you want to, have some exercise with partials and have some exercises with deep and large controlled, call it full range of motion if you want, but you don't have to go maximal on everything all the time as far as depth and extension. Some stuff is partial by design. We just mentioned a couple of them, like the floor press. It helps you with a certain part of the strength curve of a bench press. It makes you better at that portion of the movement. That's a useful tool. Why would you eliminate that? Oh no, floor presses, those don't build hypertrophy. Of course they do. They work. They're a good tool. So don't change things that are partial by design. They're like that for a reason. And overall, I think my takeaway for this point is that large range of motion tends to be pretty good, but form policing people is bad. That's stupid. Don't go up to people and be like, hey man, you could have got a little deeper on that. Or hey man, you could have extended those elbows a little more on that overhead press. Or if you've got something to say, be gentle. Be gracious with people, right? We're all brothers and sisters in this fitness journey, so let's be kind to one another. All right, that's all I've got for you guys. That's just my takes, call them hot takes if you like, on these 3 hypertrophy strategies and why they're completely non-essential to your hypertrophy program and why you could maybe consider focusing on them. But please, by all means, don't obsess over them. Guys, just go in and work hard and recover and have a good time. I'm going to be doing a part 2 eventually, so this was part 1. I hope you enjoyed. Take care and thank you so much. Leave a comment and like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one, folks.